Good evening. I'm your host, Robert McKinley Gilmore Sr. Welcome to Public Affairs, Public Access, right here at the Houston Media Source. And of course, the month of September is National Recovery Month. We have a very distinguished panel tonight. We're going to discuss some real pertinent issues affecting us not only in Houston, Texas, but around this great nation of ours. And hopefully you'll be able to call one of your friends, family members, or neighbors and let them know we might have some information that will be pertinent to help you. I'm going to let my guests introduce themselves tonight, as always, and starting with my left.
Hello, Dr. Gilmore, and hello, all of you who are watching, and to the panelists who are here. I'm your boy, Reverend Dr. Carl Matthews with Life Ministries, and I'm glad to be here and a part of this discussion tonight.
Well, good evening. I am Dr. Carolyn Evans Shabazz, and we are all, a couple of us are longtime friends from Jack Yates High School, but certainly I am the education chair and on the executive committee of the NAACP. I am also the first African-American female chairman of the board of the Houston Community College. And currently I am running for City Council District D. And I am so very thrilled to be here. Thank you so very much.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Zina Bell. I'm a psychologist, Bell Psychology Clinic. I'm involved in community engagement and community mental health outreach work. And I am glad to be on your show once again, Reverend Gilmore.
Hello, my name is Dr. Napoleon Higgins. I am a psychiatrist, child, adolescent, as well as adult psychiatrist on the southeast side of Houston in the Clear Lake area. I am president of the Black Psychiatrists of Greater Houston.
Thank you. Thank you to all my distinguished guests. I guess I can jump right in. I want to put a thought out here because one of the things that we've often talked about is how important education is. That's not only in the K-12 system, but higher education. I wanted Dr. Shabazz, you could speak to these efforts as it relates to education. I know NAACP has been involved in equity for education so long, and of course we still in Houston are under some type of siege. We don't know what it is.
Well, actually, I am, if it's any such thing, a retired educator. I really don't think it's any such animal because educators are always going around doing things to educate. And so certainly as an educator, I'm very concerned about the educational system. But one of the things that I'm really trying to push, and you psychologists will probably appreciate this, is a paradigm shift. I want us to stop telling our children that they are not college material. That certainly lowers their self-esteem from the onset, and it kind of sets the bar for them because you can imagine if somebody tells you you're not good enough for anything, it can impact you possibly throughout your lifetime. And so that's one of the things that I push. But certainly, I have a degree from Spelman College, and I have a master's from Texas Southern University in psychology, and a doctorate in education from Texas Southern University. But in my current role as Houston Community College board chair, I'm more concerned about workforce because I think that first of all, is very, very viable. And I believe that it's something, it was something that they used to offer when we were in high school, we had all kinds of courses, but certainly now they've moved to the community colleges and such. And so what I have pushed for, well, first and foremost, let me say, I've pushed for free tuition, and we do have free tuition for May 2019 graduates. And some of you aren't old enough, but we do have 50% tuition for 55 to 64 and free tuition for 65 and older. And so I push for that. But we also have associate degrees that are awarded through dual credit high schools. And we also have vocational certificates that are offered through high schools called PSOR. And so I'm really pushing for that because that's the way that we're going to change education and certainly our communities and society itself. And so I want to let people know that it's not just about the Houston Community College. It's about opportunities that we're going to have to take advantage of so that we can be gainfully employed. And that right there affects everything, basically, because it affects quality of life. And it certainly cuts down on criminal activity because most people who are gainfully employed do not participate in crime. And so education is clearly important. And as a city council member, I know that they tell us to stay in our lane. Well, I think that any city that's not concerned about the education of their citizens is not going to thrive. And so we're certainly going to have to engage a little bit more, call for a little bit more accountability, because certainly if we have a poor education system, it's not going to attract new people. Tourists, tax base, the whole thing is going to be impacted if we don't take a leadership role in pushing forward for education.
Interesting. Dr. Higgins, she alluded to this idea of the education for all. I mean, there is a chasm in between there where a person is not capable, right, of getting the education because of their mental condition. Right?
It can be. It can be. It depends upon what the mental condition is. You know, so often I tell families who are affected or individuals who are affected, too often we focus on what they can't do, but we don't focus enough on what the person actually still can do. You know, so essentially you can be a member of society and be helpful around your own personal space to yourself, to your home, to your family, and even to the community. The greater majority of what I deal with, people are doing fine. They can obtain and do everything that they want to do in life. Of course, you have to look at childhood disorders like ADHD or learning disabilities or things of that sort, but much of that can be corrected. And also realize that some people just learn differently. Some people are not, some people are that 1 in 20 in that 1 of 20 in the classroom who learns a little bit differently, who may be more of an oral reader or be able to pick up better on pictures or express themselves differently. Some people pick up information very quickly, but then if you talk too long, they can't pay attention to the rest of what you had to say. And other people say, or if you say it too fast, they didn't catch it at all. So different kids have different learning abilities, and I would say for the most part, from what I see, most can be educated quite well.
With that point, Dr. Higgins, so then my question would be, how can educators be empowered or informed to know how to identify a person's capacity to learn and what levels?
Well, I think I can answer that because I did say that I was a former educator, but actually I was a diagnostician. I actually test special ed children. That's what I did for my career. And what I found to be a problem was most of the testing was done to determine eligibility. Well, I think that the testing should be done to determine real strengths and weaknesses, which is the way that they have gone, but it's not really being used in the classroom. You know, it's still being used for eligibility, but it's not being used where teacher A can go in and say, let me see how well you're doing in math. Or teacher B can say, oh, well, he can't read above grade level so-and-so. And so if we're gonna use testing, it really needs to be utilized to identify the strengths and weaknesses and go from that point, because I do believe that all children can learn. And I know that's something that's, kind of cliche, but certainly there are certain levels that you can still attain.
Measure, determine, yeah.
You may not I may not look up and see you as a surgeon in the operating room,
Right.
but I certainly can see you in some gainful employment that is necessary for us to all engage.
Definitely
I'd like
so.
to jump in here
Yes,
and
please do.
mention your books, because you educate the community about different disorders, if it's attention deficit disorders, or your book's Mind Matters. So there's an educational component that happens for the community. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I do have 2 books out. One is called Mind Matters, a resource guide to psychiatry for Black communities, which goes and talks about the major psychiatric diagnosis in a lay type format. So essentially, we cover the deep science of mental health. We even cover how the brain works and neurotransmitters and all of that, along with depression, bipolar, anxiety. And we talk about it in regular language, which it sounds very different in regular words. And then the second book is How Amari Learned to Love School Again, a story about ADHD, where we're trying to make sure the kids in that 1st and 2nd grade age level can understand what that is. So the story basically covers how a kid is wanting to do well in school, loves school, but then starts to struggle. They do an intervention so to get the child back on track so they can continue to love school and flourish throughout the rest of the other aspects of their life. So that is done to make sure that we identify those kids, that some kids do learn a bit differently, but as we were just talking about, the need to make sure that we identify those children early. We need to do the diagnostic testing, but also we've got to put resources behind that. So often in the school district, the difficulty we're running into is teaching for the test. Who can pass the test and who can't? If you can't pass the test, we need you out of taking the test. We need to label you differently if you're going to struggle, because the teacher's job, the administrator's job, and everybody in the building's job is to whether or not you pass the test. Now, whether or not you are well educated is a different story.
After that.
That's after that, or some other time, or maybe never at all. So you have so many kids now who are graduating high school where they say 70% are functionally illiterate. They can read words, but they cannot understand concepts. So then you're trying to go off to the community college and HCC, and many of them will struggle. I've seen so many kids graduate with academic honors and then taking remedial classes in college.
And let me say this, and when they get there, they get in the remedial classes, and a lot of times they drop out because they get frustrated. They're saying, well, I can't get past this math, or I can't get past this reading, and then consequently, and they're not getting credits towards what they're there for, and consequently they drop out. And so then we have people who have gone out who do not have the credentials that they need. And we have, the Texas Higher Education Board has a mandate now. It's called 60 by 30, where 60% of students, people actually from 24 to 35 are expected to have an associate's degree or a workforce degree by the year 2030, which is going to be right here very, very soon, especially since they're not being prepared to be able to meet that challenge. So that's real important what you're saying.
The other thing I've seen is that even people that have been diagnosed, when they go to college, they don't realize that they can ask for accommodations.
Yes.
So there's something about
What do you mean?
accommodations. So if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, or you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you have some type of diagnosed condition that's been documented, you can go to the Office of Disability and have modifications made for your college classes. You just have to be able to document it. Some people don't know. They can turn in a letter, they can get it from their psychiatrist or psychologist so that they can get extra time to take tests, or they can take the test in a different format, or they can have a reader. So there's something about people not being informed about what their rights and resources are, even when they've been identified. It's like we're looking at different stages, there are different problems that occur.
Yes. Yeah, which brings to my mind, going back to your point, paradigm shift. How we approach the education from identifying or assessing strengths and weaknesses, also coupled with recognizing if there are any diagnosis, psychological diagnosis done, because when you have a person who's working in the foster care system with children at an elementary level, who have been heavily medicated from that dysfunctional background. I mean, I think the paradigm shift is teachers should be able to communicate to the administration, to the district superintendent, and TEA to be considerate of these type of dynamics that exist in our communities, so that we can give some wraparound services to give that student or child the adequate support that they need.
But
And what we try to cover in Mind Matters is being able for people to understand that there's nothing wrong with you. You just have some difficulties. I had a young lady the other day. I've been treating she was a young girl, and now she's in college and going into her junior year, struggling tremendously. So her diagnosis is ADHD. And then, as she said, she's only studying and reading. That's all she does: study, read, eat, sleep. She's not joining any sororities or anything like that. No other extracurricular activities. No boyfriend, anything. And she's struggling, thinking that if she just worked harder, she'll be just fine. Well, when I was like, well, you're taking your medication, and she's like, it's not working well enough. I don't see the point in taking it. Grades dropped when she stopped it. I said, hold on. Weren't you diagnosed as having dyslexia and agraphia? So far as you confuse the letters on the page, and you have difficulty with math and things of that sort. I saw you receiving services for that. She was like, no. I said, why not? Well, they told me I had it, but I didn't know that there were any services available. I was like, well, until we address these other issues, you're going to have a tremendous struggle in college. And so not only do you need to have the diagnosis, but then the services put into place at all levels, really realizing that this is actually an intelligent individual who learns differently. And those accommodations can be made.
And
Well,
so speak to leadership, excuse me, Doc.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Because I think this is a very valid point. I'm glad you're here, especially being a candidate for city council. Having that insight and understanding and passion. Now, your father, Doc Evans, was my basketball coach, right?
He was.
We used to have fun
Jack
with
Yates.
Doc, Yeah, we used to have fun. And so what's so interesting about Doc is that he heard you when he felt like it, and he ignored you when he wanted to.
Daddy, can I get $10? Huh? Got hearing.
Exactly. But I think it's so important, though, when people like yourself who've been exposed and know the problems and aware of the challenges, to bring their leadership to the city and use that space and sphere of influence to rally services and resources to talk about new ways and approaching to give help.
And information.
Just
as what Dr. Bell said, there are so many that don't realize that if they were diagnosed in high school, junior high, and in their pre-K through 12, that they can use those records and bring those records with them to be able to access services. But we're dealing with people who also have this peer pressure. And they get to school and they don't want to seem like they are different. But we have to drive it home that we all are different. And different doesn't mean bad or wrong or substandard. It just means different. And so it's going to be incumbent on me as a leader to make sure that the city is aware that we need to disseminate this information. Even if we are not the source of education itself, we should be a source of information so that people will know that these things are available. Yes.
It's not separate,
And I would also say, when it comes to especially your community colleges and the other resources that they have, so far as workforce, so often I find that where kids will fall into things that are, say, not 4-year degrees, believing that, well, if I can't do a 4-year, then maybe I can't make money. Well, the fact is that I know folk who do 4-year degrees who still do technical jobs that make a whole lot of money. So just because you're not the most academic prowess so far as pulling out a book and reading, a 400-page book and passing the final at the end of the grading period does not mean that you're not helpful in society. I remember a kid who did poorly in mathematics. He struggled through geometry, and I think he got passed along. He got put in a welding class. He was like the #1 student and won awards in welding. So even though he couldn't get to geometry, for some reason he could see the angles, he could understand the angles, he could understand pressure, size, weight, and the material that he was dealing with, even though he wasn't a great geometry student. So people have different type of practical knowledge, realizing that job started off coming out of high school making $35,000, $40,000 a year. career while his peers are working at fast food, working fast food when he had his certificate when he came out of high school. So realizing that school and education is multidimensional, and also you got to be careful of being locked into the falsehood that because I was a good student, that means I will be a good employee and make good money. That does not necessarily mean the same thing. There are multiple levels of intelligence that kids and families should not be. You should be worried if your child is struggling. We all have to be educated. Look at what's going on and make sure you actually address that.
And so we need to make sure that we do vocational testing to see where their interest lies, so that they will know maybe what they need to focus on. But I tell people all the time, you were very kind in what you said, but a lot of trades make a whole lot more money than the 4-year degrees.
Right.
I mean, you call a plumber and you get good and ready to pay you a nice bill. An electrician, all of the different trades that and Lord, don't let your car break down. They certainly, and the thing is, they can be entrepreneurs, own their own businesses, and pull in whatever they need to pull in to be able to, of course they need to be competitive, but at the same time, if I'm sitting there and my toilet has gone over, I'm going to pay you whatever you say. And I'm not going to call and say, well, what did you say? Because I got you right here, and you're telling me what it's going to cost to fix the problem. And so certainly they need to realize that there is much value in vocational trades.
Now, one thing we've got to really think about, I guess, Dr. Bell, you can jump in on this, is how affected parents are. Because at some point, it seems like nowadays parents lose the grip, if you understand what I'm saying. When that kid gets to be like 15 or 16, seems like it's not the same as it was when our parents were raising us.
Much sooner.
Well,
At 8, they lose the grip.
I'm gonna let Dr. Bell answer this, and then I have something to say about all of that.
I think part of what we talk about is like the social media and the change in the technology and how it's affected the amount of information that children have and how overstimulated they are, and that parents are working and they may not recognize their child is overstimulated by all of what they're exposed to.
Explain overstimulated.
Overstimulated is when you are going from Instagram to Snapchat to Facebook to Twitter to whatever else.
Wait a minute now. You know. I think the computer addiction was added.
As a diagnosis? I saw it as a problem.
Yes,
I saw it as a problem.
It was not in the last DSM-5, and they added it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So I'm talking about that the attention span may be a little bit shorter. People are jumping from one topic to the next, and parents have to be able to monitor what their children are looking at, even though they may be overwhelmed by what they all have going on. So the overstimulation makes it more difficult for children to retain information in the classroom.
But Dr. Bell, I don't see how parents can be instrumental in that, because parents are inundated or consumed with Facebook and Instagram themselves. I mean, I was in a restaurant the other day and saw a couple there, and they was having dinner supposedly together, a family night, but each one of them was on their phone, not even talking to each other.
So our ability to communicate and to relate to each other and to establish relationships has decreased, which means that we have poorer communication skills, which means we may have more difficulty regulating our emotions, and because it kind of all goes together, it's holistic. So I think what we're saying is that what happens we invent these things and then we have to back up and look at how they're affecting our lives. Do we have ethics as they're concerned? Are they being regulated? And is it just a capitalistic ploy? I'm talking about commercialism and the advertisement that goes along with it. That's propelling.
You really bring it up something, because this whole issue of vaping and all of a sudden, And all of a sudden, this vaping is I don't know, it seems like it's worse than cigarettes.
But they were marketing it to the teenagers, and they allowed that to happen. I watched in high school as those children were vaping. Jewel was presenting that, the marketing strategy.
Right.
So anyway, all I'm saying
Yeah.
is that sometimes we allow things to happen, and we don't have the mechanisms in place to monitor and to manage it.
I'm going to take it in a different direction.
Sure.
It's very important that parents make a livable wage. The reason being, no one should have to work 2 and 3 jobs to survive and to provide for their family. And when you look at it, when you have to work 2 and 3 jobs, that's the breakdown of the family right there. And we know that parental engagement is very important because somebody needs to go to the school to support the child, the activities, church, all of those different things. But if you have to work 2 and 3 jobs, that's why it's very important for me as a leader to push for livable wages. Because it's just unbelievable when you see, oh, I got to go to work at 10 o'clock tonight, and then I got to go to another job at 7 in the morning. Well, and then you do what? You leave your child unattended for those, especially those vital hours after they get off where they tend to get into trouble. But it's because you're having to work 2 and 3 jobs. So livable wages is very, very important as well.
Also, I would say that, just the inability to disconnect, from work. I mean, the fact is that if you can't find me, that means that I'm ignoring you. I mean, because you got, I got my
Is that
cell
a strategy?
phone. My cell phone, my home phone, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. There are so many ways to find a person. So with many of our jobs, the job continues when you leave work. There's a whole set of things to get done before you get back to work the next day, and then you have a child who's just sitting there, and in their hand is the entire world. And the world wants an influence on that child. And that becomes very scary when the parent is tied up. They don't have time for the child. Sometimes the job or the working 2 and 3 jobs, the side hustle, things of that sort. And then the world has access at the same time. Now we're looking at a serious problem where the child is not being monitored, and then the world knows that as well, and that creates a big issue.
So that 11-year-old boy that drove how many 4 hours in South Carolina, 200 miles, because of a man he met on Snapchat. That he met on Snapchat. He got the car and drove 200 miles.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you what would have happened to me, in terms of, but even in Houston, we've had 2 or 3 tragic situations where children have access, and the abnormalness is becoming normal.
Right.
And speaking of what happened to you, I always reflect back on when I came up, right? And I remember we had group 1, group 2, and group 3. But everybody graduated.
Yeah.
I don't remember children being pulled out in the resource rooms and those kinds of things. So it's changed so much.
Right.
And I know people that were in group 3 that were very successful.
Right.
And so I don't know where we really changed, where we really lost education, other than when we did the crossover.
Right.
And you and I were there at Yates when the faces of the teachers no longer looked like us.
Right, that's right.
And we wanted equity, certainly, but there was a different feeling. We were actually raised by village.
Right,
If you went to the grocery store.
So in a sense then, part of our dysfunction has really been a result of the progress.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
I mean, I believe that my high school class could have competed with anybody.
Right.
Okay? But, of course, we got to the 11th grade, and so certainly it was great that we had great elementary and junior high schools. But I know that when we changed, there was just a different culture.
Right.
Because a lot of times the other ethnicities came and they were the teachers. They were afraid of the students.
Right,
The students
that's right.
knew they were afraid of them.
That's right.
And they really couldn't engage appropriately.
Right.
Whereas, both my parents were educators. You could go to Rice Food Market and you could run into Mr. Such and Such, and he better have a good report on you when he saw your parents at the grocery store. But it's so different now because the teacher now does not necessarily look like the student, and they go clear across town now. The student knows, oh, well, they're not going to run into Miss Abernathy because she doesn't live in my neighborhood. And so, as you said, we have called ourselves progressing, but I think it really set us back a lot to not have the teachers look like us.
That's part of it, and research documents that. But
Yes.
even now, if you ran into Miss Abernathy in the grocery store, she may have her device and not even
You
make
are
eye
so
contact
right.
with you. Because we're preoccupied
Yes.
with
Yes.
devices and not connecting in that
That's the
way.
truth.
And I think that's part of what we lost with the crossover, that there was a disruption in the relationships and the ability to connect with each other. And when you talk about a village, that's what we had.
Yes.
Well, how do we recover? I mean, this is
That's where the shift comes in the paradigm. So we're talking about healing communities
Right.
or community healing workshops. And within those workshops, we're saying we're going to learn how to trust each other. We're going to learn how to have honest communication. We're going to dispel that myth of crabs in the barrel mentality. And we're going to say it's okay to be a part of an African American culture. We're no longer going to say, I have to step back and not own my being black. Because in some ways we would damp it down because it was unacceptable. I think we've lost some of that, and we have to be able to connect with each other
But
in
now-
a trusting, honest way.
Now, I've heard and read some things about the fact that some African Americans don't want to be reminded that this is the 400th year of our
Being brought from Africa.
being brought from Africa. I've heard people say, I don't want to hear that. And even when it's been brought up in conversation, I mean, it's almost like we're not even connecting with the true identity of the people. I mean,
It's a work in progress. So,
Other ethnicities do not disavow
50 more years.
themselves.
well,
They accept what happened to them.
the
And
Jewish people.
Yes, but
there's-
we disavow.
we lost our language,
Yes.
we lost our religion, we lost our ancestors. There was a trauma that occurred that has not been addressed, which is different from what Jewish people experienced. They had what do you call the book of their religious book that has the history
Torah?
in it?
The Torah.
Torah,
Right,
yeah,
they have the
okay.
Torah. They had their language. So there's a different trauma, and within the trauma that slavery, the way that it affected us, we actually have to take responsibility for healing from that trauma.
I guess that's what reparations is about. Somewhat.
Now, I'm not even going to process this idea of the ongoing quest for reparations. It traumatizes me to even think somebody's going to give me 40 acres and a mule.
Come on now.
I don't know what I would
And then
do. Where would it
without
be,
telling
Matthews?
you how to invest that 40 acres.
I don't know if 40 acres
In
is
Utah, it would
No, they don't have 40 acres in the third ward. Not
even
contiguous.
not be able to
get in
Not
third ward,
contiguous.
okay?
No.
Well, we know it's not going to be in some flooded areas, because that obviously would be traumatizing. And that brings me to the idea of the ongoing trauma we suffer as a nation, because whether it's a flood or a tropical storm or whatever. I mean, this idea of mental stability is definitely a questionable reality nowadays. You understand what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah,
I'm saying
definitely.
You using all of these devices, and they're not going anywhere. If anything, I've seen people with the phone.
And the
Apple
watch.
Watch.
The Apple Watch.
It threw me off because I was wondering, well, who are they talking?
Why are they talking to their arm?
And I realized.
Well, that's just like with the earpiece. People are wondering who you're talking to. And it's kind of like you have to make sure that on the phone. You know, I haven't lost it yet.
Right.
You know.
So how do we, let's just say, I've been making this statement. So in the next 20 years, what will it look like in terms of mental stability, people understanding what they need to do? I can imagine you'll be raising a child till they're 10, then you let them go somewhere, give them 2 pills maybe.
Oh my God.
What would it be like? I mean, I'm just curious.
I have no idea, because I was like, a grocery store. You know, you don't have to go to grocery store. You can just go onto Amazon and order. You can go curbside.
Well, they're doing that now.
You're right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So in 20 years, what's it going to look like? Is it going to be the Jetsons? I mean,
And what will social activity look like? Everybody's walking around with a phone now.
I've been money that we are going to a restaurant, and I actually may be having a conversation with a group of people who are not here. That essentially I would be looking
A virtual
at
type.
I would just be virtually where I'll be virtual somewhere else, even though I'm sitting here in front of you. I mean, it's just an odd paradigm, this lack of humanity, and I think and some people will attribute that to the mass shootings that we see. That people are not talking and speaking to people, so you're lacking humanity, and you're seeing people virtually. You're not seeing them as real people because you're not making as many connections as you typically would.
Therefore, it's
And
not a
parents
threat
are going
to
to
you.
have to insist when you go to a restaurant that you put your devices down. If you want to sit there and look mad, you can do that. But at the same time, as a parent, we have to be parents. We can't be afraid of our children and afraid where we don't tell them this is not appropriate. We're going to talk. We're going to interact. I want to know what went on with you today, what you're planning to do tomorrow, the future, whatever. If it's just for the meal time.
Well, that's key. I know my mom, who was a previous school counselor, would say that anytime you hear a parent say that them and their child don't talk, basically that means they don't eat together.
Yeah.
That means you don't eat together. Because anytime you're sitting down with a plate of food, people talk to each other, assuming they put the devices
Mother
down.
would have been reported, right?
Yeah.
For, what is that called? Neglect,
Child abuse.
One of y'all would have called and said, I'm not being fed.
Yeah.
That would have been George already, right?
We want to sit here and talk. We about to eat food, and you mean you're not going to talk to me?
Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to need to take a quick break, and then we'll come right back. So stay with us right here, Public Affairs, Public Access, as we take a quick break, and you can call your neighbor, call your friend. Thank you very much. We'll be right back.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. You've rejoined us for another edition of Public Affairs, Public Access. And Dr. Higgins was just telling us about in the future you'll have virtual meetings. How will that work again?
Well, we already have virtual meetings where we're on the telephone, on video with individuals, but soon I would say that you would have a screen in front of you, or maybe even a screen on your glasses. But soon we'll be in the holograms as well. So essentially we'll be sitting at a room, and none of us will be here. We'll be all in our individual spaces and seeing each other like we are right now in hologram spaces. They already have the technology.
Right.
The question is it marketable, and can you get the price right?
Right.
So then you're going to see less and less human interactions with people and more of a virtual where you just don't talk to people or see people. You'll see an image of them.
So my fantasy, so part of my fantasy is that people will become uncomfortable with touch.
Oh, really?
Yes.
How does that work?
Because it's virtual. Because you're virtual, and you don't have that direct connection, you'll be less comfortable with somebody reaching over and touching you. So that was one of the things that when we were talking, I was thinking that we might see a shift in. And my other concern is that people, because they're not interacting with each other, they're really not going to know what their emotions are, you know, what their feelings are, or how to label them. And because we're using videos and fantasy, when fantasy doesn't fit reality, it's a little more difficult to accept what reality might be.
So you think that the emotions of a human being is really what keeps them a human being?
No, I won't just say emotions. You know, it all goes together. Emotions, feelings, behaviors.
Right.
It's just being able to practice having them in a real way with someone one-on-one. I think we're going to see more difficulty with that.
Isn't that why the use of all these devices, you know, substitutes having the actual emotion, and even in the sense of you dealing with people who can't control their emotions? Isn't that a factor? I mean,
Well, I think you become disconnected slowly.
Disconnected.
You're disconnected slowly. I do some work with telemedicine, and it's okay. I can see you and I can hear you well, but there's that I tell people I can't smell you, and when I say that, I'm referring to there's a lack of depth in the room.
Right.
I always can tell that the interviews tend to be a little bit quicker, a little bit faster.
Right.
The person doesn't divulge more information,
Right.
and I'm not as engaged when I'm actually looking at a mom and a child right there and looking at the dynamic and the energy in the room. So you still lose that energy level when you're not in the room with one another. And you see that with families where people don't talk to each other. The kid comes in, they go upstairs, food is done, mom or dad or whoever may get their food, kid goes back upstairs, and there's no communication in the house. So that is, I think, a dynamic that I think we'll see further play out, and I think it has, implications further down the road where people don't care or what happens to the humanity of the other person because simply they're not connected.
And with that being said, man, the majority of the consumers or human beings or citizens, whatever category, they're not even interpreting or processing it at the level in which you're sharing, right? And what you're sharing, Dr.
Yeah.
Bell.
Right.
So since we know we're not going to reverse that, then how do people need to be informed about being aware of those type of disconnections being affected in that way, right? Because me as a businessman, Zoom works. Loom works. It allows me to expand my reach, right? We know in the faith-based community, I recommend social media platforms because it expands your reach. So for me, I know that these tools are great, but I have a perspective about why and what they need to be used for. So I think that kind of education needs to be shared so people can understand. Don't become so engaged that you disconnect, because being a single man trying to date through texting, I can't even roll with that, right? Because I want to hear the voice. I'm old school. I want to talk to you and what have you. I want to eventually see you. But even in the single life, the phone and texting seems to be the methodology used to get acquainted with someone. And it may have some validity to the fact of, I want to get a chance to kind of feel you out, get to know you. I don't know what kind of person you are. But again, I think there's other alternatives can be utilized. Public place meeting, lit area, other people around, give me a chance to evaluate who I'm talking to.
Well, I know even with our group, with Global Health Psychiatry, we've written 2 books, but we meet normally at least twice a year. So even though we talk virtually every day via the text group messaging, and we meet on the phone on a regular basis, sometimes even groups of us may FaceTime, but the fact is that we need to see each other every once in a while, because we notice that we have more in-depth conversations when we're actually in the room at the same time. So there's a need to be conscious about that, but I would say for families especially, there's a need to have a conscious dynamic that we must communicate inside the home, face to face, and have conversations. You need to know what's going on with your child, and your spouse and your child need to need to know what's going on with you.
And the key word is conscious, that you have to make a conscious effort, because the parents at this stage have been raised with devices. They grew up with devices too.
That's true.
So they would have to make a conscious choice to put their device down and to have an ongoing conversation with their child. And look at them when they walked in the room, instead of walking in and catching up on whatever they may have recorded or their Facebook page. And I think that might be one of the PSAs we need.
So it sounds like just taking responsibility.
But
In other words, a responsible parent, it's your responsibility to pay attention to your children.
I think you have to tell them now. I think it has to be said.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by a PSA.
Sure.
That we, back in the day we had PSAs on how to cross the street,
Right.
not littering. I think you have PSAs on not texting and driving. Pay attention to your child. Put your phone down.
So it sounds like an Amber Alert. More than a PSA.
Whatever the need is. I know they were talking about the problem associated with people speeding past school buses. 2 or 3 children have been
Hit.
and almost hit, and horrific pictures of people just screw the stop sign. Just you have to be okay. Do I need to give you 2 years in jail, or can I educate you about this process?
I think we developed the technology before we put the mechanisms in place. And even though we were aware that we needed to put the mechanisms in place, we did not. I think the same thing is happening with this marijuana stuff. I think that we know that it's going to be a problem. We know it's addictive, and we're going around legalizing something, and we haven't put mechanisms in place. We saw what happened with alcohol. Why are you doing this backwards? What do you want to accomplish?
Well, when you look at marijuana, to me, marijuana and Juul, and those electronic stuff, all took off at the same time.
Right.
And how safe Juuls were and all of that. I remember one time being in a restaurant, somebody was smoking vaping, and they had this coconut flavor just going everywhere. And I was like, why would I want to walk into a restaurant and have to smell your coconut when I'm trying to eat my food?
Allergic to coconut.
Yeah. And then I'm like, what is that smell, and why is it so potent? And what gases are you releasing into the air when we do that?
It wasn't. It was not considered a cigarette normally.
No.
Right. So then you're in a restaurant, whereas with cigarettes they said no secondhand smoke,
right,
but they didn't do the same thing with vaping. I don't know. I don't make laws.
But the stuff comes out, and the fact is that you learn later.
Yeah.
What it's going to do, versus trying to get the science in before you actually let it come out.
Yeah.
So now with the issue of marijuana, with this being
legalized medically as well.
everybody doesn't smoke and do all right. I see a whole lot of that in my office. I see psychotic kids, psychotic adults, depression, and all kind of odd things happening. Now, it doesn't happen to everybody, but telling people that it's going to be okay and in its natural form of whatever, then they're going to be all right. That is not the situation for everybody. That is not the situation for everybody. So needing to know what the warnings are very important.
That's over 30 states now.
Yeah.
In America.
But they're not doing the work.
I don't know, not to be conspiracy about it, I think they're trying to dumb down the population. I mean, just keep people in a state of keep people in an altered state, realizing that when you're in an altered state, you may not be making the best decisions. I'm not saying that, so I'm saying you're trying to control people by leaving them messed up all the time. But also realizing that marijuana is not the same marijuana. So the marijuana that they have today this is not what Bob Marley smoked. This is completely different strains.
More than one love, huh?
Yes, there's a whole lot going on.
But the whole idea of capitalism and capitalizing at the disadvantage of humanity is not new.
Right.
No,
Right?
that's not new.
I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking from a biblical standpoint of a brother who was in a graveyard, who was running through there violently,
Right.
damaging himself, harming himself. Nobody wanted to deal with him in society. And he's just overtaken by demonic spirits. And so when Jesus comes upon him, he rebukes the demons, you know, over 1,000 of them, and they go into the swine. Well, the swine happen to be the commodity of those who were swine herders. They go to town and get a posse, a riot, come back and want to kill Jesus. They had more interest in their swine that had a value than human life.
Yeah.
And so I think we're kind of probably seeing that through commercialism, merchandising, at the expense
Of the population.
Yeah.
of us.
Right.
Yeah.
Found comments, Dr. Bill.
Community healing, healing communities. Be conscious of what you put in your body, what you put in your mind.
Right.
Make efforts to see people and establish relationships.
Relationships. Yeah.
Relationships.
Dr. Higgins.
Well, my final thoughts would be, you know, we talked about education, how important education is. If you're having difficulty in education, please address that early in children. Understanding that we need to be able to communicate, talk to your child, talk within the family, and that's where a lot of healing occurs, when we are able to speak and communicate and find the humanity in one another.
As two professionals, would you recommend that people become a little bit more intensely aware of mental conditions within their own families and themselves?
You know what? I was looking up something on the internet the other day, and the question that was posed to me was, how many people see a psychiatrist in a year's time? And I couldn't find that number, but I did find where essentially 40% of Americans will access mental health care within 1 year.
Right.
40%. So that's between psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, advanced nurse practitioners, counseling at the school.
Right.
I would say when you add counseling at the school, I would give that 50 or 60%.
Right.
So mental health is very big. We need to address it quickly, address it early, realizing that the majority of things you don't have to suffer from, but you do have to do something about it.
Right.
So I would say, even especially for the black community and our community, the call of running away from your mental health as if it will go away, not realizing the damage that it does to you and your family when you're not mentally well. You know, so you want to get to your mental optimum, or what I call it, black mental wealth. You want to get to black mental wealth. So essentially, not only are you surviving, but you're thriving with your mind.
I love it.
Well, Dr. Bill, you...
Oh, I agree with what Dr. Higgins has said, and in addition, I would like to see us focusing on what we do right. You know, what we have done well. What are our strengths? Our spirituality, our relationships, our ability to have fun and to be in the presence of each other. I think when you take that away from us, it makes us less of a people. So I'd like to see us congregate more. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something intense, just the ability to sit down and to talk. You know, we used to rap. Why can't we just rap?
Great segue, Dr. Matthews. Congregate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, I did all the point: education, information, and assimilation. One of the things that we're doing with Youth Ministers Against Crime as the assistant project coordinator is we are gathering information from agencies and service providers who provide services and give assistance, and to make that available to the faith community so that they can have access to helping their parishioners, helping the people in their community. Not only that, but providing training for parishioners, congregations, to be empowered on how to interact with returning citizens, working with children, youth, with behavior issues, those kind of things, with self-esteem, family matters. Because I believe most parents have good intention. They just may not be armed or empowered knowing what to do, how to do, or where to go even. And I'm hearing a lot of that as well. So what we're doing is, I know I'm aware of problems, but I really like to spend my time on solutions. And so I'm generating 90% of my efforts in creating something that will provide those type of tools to the community, faith-based leaders and their parishioners, so that we can we have outlets to empower them.
And more churches are engaging now
Absolutely.
than 20 years ago.
That's right.
With the reality of mental illness and its related problems.
That's correct.
Forced, if you would. It also leads us to the awareness that the ongoing information from National Recovery Month, which is a national effort, is primarily to break this stigma. And ever since the new DSM-5 came out, it added the comorbidity as a point for reference, that if a person had a mental illness, then quite frankly, there was going to be some type of a drug involved. And we've heard the research, so many individuals who are incarcerated, you know, that were affected by some type of drug. And then, of course, we got these new Juul and whatever they got out here. I have no idea, but obviously it is decimating some young populations of people faster than cigarettes.
Yeah.
So it continues, like you said, in terms of capitalism. But hopefully, Dr. Shabazz has left us going on to another appointment. We'll be able to have leaders who are going to be sympathetic and empathetic to what we need to do. And because we can't do it by ourselves.
That's right.
And those of you out there who might have problems in your families, your neighborhoods, you've got to be aware. I mean, mass shootings have become a reality in our society. You got to watch every way you go, regardless, church, school, you name it. I mean, that is hopefully not going to be a norm, but we can address it.
Sure.
The state legislature has put more money, supposedly, in terms of dealing with behavior problems, and those of us who are professionals want to do our best to try to access those services for people who need it. So we're asking you as individuals and community leaders and members to not only link with organizations and groups like those at the table tonight, or NAMI and MHA and others, but reach out to clergy leaders and people in your school and community that will give you some help. You can always reach us if you need to through the Houston media source, Public Affairs, Public Access. We thank them for the opportunity again. Thank all of my guests. A great roundtable discussion tonight. Hope you got something out of it. And they're going to keep broadcasting after 30 years plus. I want you to stay tuned. There's more information coming your way. Good evening. It's a blessing.